stay. It all started with a single tiny sound, a whisper, or maybe just the faint scrape of something dragging across wood. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, except for the fact that I live alone. The house is small, just 2 bedrooms with a narrow staircase leading up from the living room, and normally it's as quiet as a tomb. The sound came around midnight while I was lying in bed. At first, I figured it was the house settling, or maybe a tree brushing against the roof. But then, every night around the same time, I'd hear it again. A faint scraping, sometimes a whispering. Every night, the sound grew louder. After about a week, I started to think maybe I wasn't imagining it. I'd get up, check the rooms, inspect the locks, look out the windows. Nothing. The house was empty every night, but that feeling, being watched, would follow me back to bed, where I'd lie awake, feeling it hovering just outside my door. One night, the scratching turned into knocking. 3 deliberate knocks, echoing down the stairs from the attic door. My heart pounded, but I told myself it was just a loose latch or an animal. I grabbed my phone and decided to record it, just to prove to myself it was nothing. I opened the recording app, pressed record, and waited. And then, there it was. 3 distinct knocks, knock, 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 so loud I could feel it vibrating through the floor. I shot up in bed, adrenaline spiking as I stared at my phone's screen. The recording had stopped on its own, but there was no sound saved. I felt a chill run through me, and in that moment, every nerve in my body screamed that I wasn't alone. Over the next few nights, things escalated. Shadows started shifting in the corners of rooms. Sometimes I'd walk into the kitchen and see cabinets open, or chairs move slightly from where I'd left them. I'd find objects in places I'd never put them. And then, as if mocking me, the knocking started again. But now it was coming from the bedroom walls. One night I was lying in bed, clutching the blankets, trying to ignore the sounds. But the knocks kept coming. 3 distinct taps against the wall, and then louder, something like nails scraping down the plaster. I buried my head in the pillow, willing it to stop. But then I felt something that made my blood run cold. Breathing. Just above me, barely a foot from my face, I could feel warm, slow breaths. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare open my eyes. It was like someone, or something, was lying right next to me, watching, waiting. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, slow and steady until I finally drifted into a terrified sleep. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to do some digging into the house's history, anything that might explain what was happening. I called a local historian, who didn't know much about my house specifically, but mentioned that the area had a dark history. A sanitarium nearby had burned down decades ago, and apparently there were stories of hauntings all through the neighborhood. That night, as I lay in bed, I noticed something else in the room. It was a faint glow coming from the corner, just at the edge of my vision. It wasn't bright enough to light the room, but it was there. A pair of glinting eyes. My heart pounded as I stared at the corner, willing myself not to blink. Then, a face emerged in the faint glow. It was as if it had been watching me from the shadows, just waiting for me to notice it. The face was twisted, hollow-eyed, with a wide, toothless grin that stretched far too wide. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in place, as the face drew closer, like it was inching forward through the darkness. And then, without warning, it vanished. I let out a shuddering breath, barely able to keep myself from screaming. The next thing I knew, The entire room seemed to vibrate, a deep rumbling that shook the walls, rattling the windows. My bed began to shake, bouncing against the floor as if something were trying to toss me right out. I bolted from the bed and stumbled down the stairs, gripping the railing as the whole house seemed to come alive with noise. I reached the front door, only to find it wouldn't budge. Panicked, I threw myself against it, slamming my fists. But it was like the house itself had trapped me inside. Then I heard it, just behind me. A low, guttural growl reverberating through the hall. Slowly, I turned, my hand still clutching the doorknob. There, at the top of the staircase, was the same twisted face, staring down at me. Only now it had a body, distorted and inhuman, hunched over, with long, spindly limbs. Its mouth hung open, dark and endless, as if it could swallow me whole. I scrambled backward, my pulse thundering as the creature took a step forward, then another, slowly making its way down the stairs. I backed into the living room, searching frantically for anything that could help me, a weapon, anything at all. But the creature was relentless, closing in with each unnatural step. Suddenly, all the lights in the room burst to life, blindingly bright. The creature stopped, shrinking back as if the light was somehow hurting it. I grabbed the closest lamp and held it out like a shield. For a moment it hesitated, its eyes narrowing as if weighing whether it was worth the risk. Then it let out a screeching, guttural wail that shook the entire house and vanished, fading into the shadows just as quickly as it had appeared. The lights flickered, then returned to normal, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the living room, shaking and clutching the lamp. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I stayed with a friend while I looked for a new place, too terrified to even think about going back. When I returned a few weeks later to gather the last of my things, the house was silent, and there was no sign of the creature or the twisted face in the shadows. But as I was leaving, I noticed something carved into the doorframe near the staircase. It was small, barely noticeable, but there, scratched into the wood, was a single word: stay. The shadows in the dark. My whole life, I've been afraid of the dark. People always told me it was just a phase, that I'd grow out of it. But the darkness never felt empty to me. It was always like it was watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. Even when I got older, the feeling never went away. I know how it sounds. Irrational, childish. But that fear, it's not something I can just shake off. I've tried. God, how I've tried. It started to get worse after I moved into my new apartment. The place was cheap, close to my job, and had that charming vintage vibe I'd always wanted. It seemed like a perfect fit, until the sun went down. The building was old, creaky, with narrow hallways that seemed to stretch into the shadows. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, with big windows that let in a lot of light during the day. But at night, those windows seemed to turn into gaping black mouths, swallowing the room in darkness. My first night there, I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump. The floors creaked like someone was walking through the hallways, and the wind outside the windows howled as if trying to slip through the cracks. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every nerve on edge, convinced I heard something moving in the shadows at the edge of my vision. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that I was adjusting to a new place. But it felt different, heavier, more intense. Like the shadows in the corners of my room were denser than they should be, pooling in ways that made my skin crawl. I left the bathroom light on as a nightlight, feeling foolish but desperate for some comfort. And that's when it started. The first time I thought it was a nightmare. I woke up in the middle of the night, my throat tight, my chest heavy, like something was pressing down on me. My room was pitch black, except for the thin strip of light coming from the bathroom. As my eyes adjusted, I realized there was something wrong with the shadows on my bedroom floor. They shifted, swirled, almost like they were moving. I couldn't look away. I stared, paralyzed, as the shadows seemed to stretch, pulling away from the corner of the room and creeping closer to my bed. My breath hitched, and my skin prickled with icy fear. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Just when I thought the darkness would swallow me whole, a car passed by outside, its headlights cutting through my window and casting a beam of light across the floor. The shadows retreated instantly, disappearing as if they had never been there. I gasped for air, clutching the blankets, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next few nights, it only got worse. I'd wake up at odd hours, always with the same suffocating feeling, the same sense that something was lurking in the darkness, watching me. I could hear it, a faint, rustling sound, like dry leaves scraping against each other. Sometimes I thought I heard whispering, just on the edge of hearing. I kept the lights on, every single one, but even then, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision. One night, I woke up to find the bathroom light flickering. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, staring at the door. The light buzzed, flashing in and out, casting strange, twisting shadows across the walls. I tried to tell myself it was just an electrical issue, but the shadows, they weren't right. They writhed, coiling around each other like snakes, stretching toward me. Suddenly, the light went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I scrambled for my phone, fumbling with trembling fingers to turn on the flashlight. My mind screamed at me that I was being foolish, that nothing was there, but I couldn't shake the feeling of cold dread that settled in my bones. When the flashlight clicked on, I swept it across the room. For a moment, I thought I saw something, just a shape, hunched and twisted, lurking near the closet. But the beam caught only empty space, revealing nothing but the familiar outline of my furniture. I sat there shaking, listening to my own ragged breathing until the sun finally rose. I called an electrician the next morning to fix the bathroom light. He said the wiring was old, that it could cause flickering sometimes, but I could tell he thought I was being paranoid. I tried to brush it off too, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone in that apartment. It was as if something was waiting for me, just beyond the edge of the light. Then, one night, everything changed. I woke up, gasping, my heart thundering in my chest. The room was darker than I'd ever seen it. So dark that I couldn't see the outline of my own hand in front of my face. I reached for my phone, but it wasn't on the nightstand where I usually kept it. A faint sound drifted through the air, barely audible. A whisper. So cold. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was close, so close that I felt the breath of it on my ear. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the voice grew louder, more insistent, like it was speaking directly into my mind. Come with me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I felt something cold brush against my cheek, like a hand, skeletal and impossibly thin. Tears leaked from my eyes, and I whispered a desperate plea into the darkness. Please, leave me alone. The room seemed to tremble, the shadows pressing in around me, closing in from every side. And then, suddenly, the bathroom light flickered back on. The shadows retreated, sliding back into the corners, disappearing like smoke. I jumped out of bed, panting, and ran to the living room, turning on every light I could find. Frankly, I don't remember how long I sat there, shivering on the couch, hugging my knees to my chest. But I knew one thing. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The next morning, I packed a bag and booked a room at a hotel nearby. I called my landlord, told him there was something wrong with the wiring, made up some excuse about needing to stay somewhere else until it was fixed. He promised to send someone over, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. It didn't matter. I just needed to get out of there. But even at the hotel, I couldn't escape it. I tried to sleep with the lights on, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows writhing beneath my eyelids, twisting into unnatural shapes. And I heard the voice, whispering in the back of my mind, growing more desperate, more furious. Come with me. On the third night, I woke up in my hotel room, staring at the ceiling, my breath fogging in the cold air. The lights were on, but they flickered like they did in the apartment. My heart sank. The darkness outside the windows pressed against the glass, thicker than it should be, like a living thing. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw it. A figure, just a shade darker than the shadows, hunched and twisted. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a hollow, gaping void, eyes like pits that seemed to swallow the light. It reached out a hand, long and skeletal, fingers stretching toward me. I tried to move, to scream, but I couldn't. My body was paralyzed, held captive by the thing's gaze. Come with me, it whispered, the voice echoing inside my skull, filling my head with ice. You cannot hide. You belong in the dark. Tears streamed down my face as I fought against the invisible force holding me down. The figure slid closer, its presence filling the room with a cold so intense that my breath crystallized in the air. Then, just as it reached my bedside, a car horn blared outside, breaking the silence. Light flooded through the window, washing over the figure. It recoiled, its form dissolving like smoke in the wind. I gasped, finally able to move, and threw myself out of the bed, trembling violently. That night, I didn't go back to sleep. I packed my things and left the hotel, driving without a destination, just needing to put as much distance between myself and that thing as I could. I don't know where it came from or why it chose me, but I know that it's still out there, waiting in the dark, lurking in the shadows where the light can't reach. And even now, as I sit here in a bright, crowded cafe, I can feel it watching me from the shadowy corners, biding its time. It's only a matter of time before the lights flicker again. And when they do, I don't think I'll be able to escape. Bloodlines in the walls. When I first bought the old house, I thought I was getting a good deal. It was in my budget, had plenty of space, and though it was run down, it felt inviting. The realtor barely seemed to want to talk about its history, brushing off any questions I asked. At the time, I figured she was just eager to make a sale. Now, I realized she just didn't want to revisit the horrors of that place. My first week went by uneventfully. I was working late most nights, and since the house needed plenty of repairs, I often only had the energy to stumble into bed, barely taking note of the little oddities. The creak of the floorboards, the sound of something scratching the walls in the dead of night. It was about a week later, one Friday night, that things started going terribly wrong. I'd just gotten back from the store. arms loaded with groceries. As I walked into the kitchen, I noticed a faint, coppery smell hanging in the air. I searched around, expecting to find a leak or mold, but found nothing. The smell lingered though, growing stronger each night. By Sunday, the entire house reeked of it. That night, I was washing dishes when I saw it. The first real sign that something was terribly wrong. As I looked at the wall beside the sink, I noticed dark streaks dripping down from the corner near the ceiling. It looked like rust at first, but the color was a deep, sickening red. My heart started racing as I reached out and touched it, only to pull my hand back quickly. It was warm, sticky. It was blood. I stood there staring at my hand, trying to convince myself that I was mistaken. Maybe it was some weird stain, some ancient plumbing issue. I grabbed a towel, trying to wipe it off the wall, but the more I scrubbed, the more it seemed to seep out, flowing down like an open wound. Horrified, I backed away, refusing to believe what I was seeing. Then came the knocking. I heard it first from the walls, a soft tapping that turned into a rhythmic, hollow thud. It was coming from every direction, the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath my feet. I forced myself to ignore it, running into the living room and huddling in the corner, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But the tapping grew louder, a relentless, angry sound that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The following day, I called a plumber and an electrician, thinking there had to be a logical explanation. But they couldn't find anything wrong. They couldn't even find any pipes in that part of the wall. And that night, as I lay in bed, I heard the knocking again, louder and more insistent, punctuated by the sound of something scratching against the wood. It was as if something was trapped inside the walls, clawing to get out. I could barely sleep, my eyes glued to the ceiling, listening to that awful scratching. And then, around 3 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural whisper. It was faint, barely audible over the thudding and scratching, but it was there, repeating something over and over in a language I didn't understand. I felt my body go rigid, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in that bed as the whispering grew louder, closer, as if someone were leaning down, their mouth inches from my ear. Leave. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, the room was freezing. My windows were closed and my heater had been on, but the air was icy, each breath forming a faint mist. I sat up, shivering, and noticed that my walls were covered in words, scrawled in dark red streaks that looked disturbingly like blood. Get out! I stumbled out of bed, my mind racing. I was still half convinced it was a nightmare, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I moved through the house, I saw the same message repeated in every room, smeared across the walls, the floors, even the ceilings. The stench of blood filled the air, thick and nauseating, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I had to get out. I grabbed my keys and ran outside, barely pausing to lock the door. I stayed at a motel that night, convinced that something in that house was trying to drive me out. I didn't return for days, too terrified to even go near the place. But as the week went on, I told myself it had to have been some kind of breakdown, a mental lapse from the stress of moving. Finally, I mustered the courage to go back. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, and the walls were clean, free of any messages. The smell of blood was gone, replaced by the familiar mustiness of old wood and dust. I felt foolish, almost embarrassed at how easily I'd scared myself. I spent that day cleaning, trying to restore some sense of normalcy. That night, I slept soundly until something woke me around midnight. At first, I thought it was just a nightmare, but then I realized that the bed was shaking. It started as a faint tremor, growing stronger until the entire frame was rattling against the floor. I sat up, heart racing, just in time to see a shadow move across the wall. It was a figure, tall and thin, with long clawed hands that seemed to scrape against the wall as it moved. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes glowing faintly red in the dark. I froze, watching as it slithered closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Then, in one swift motion, it lunged toward me. I screamed, scrambling off the bed and bolting for the door, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would burst. I ran down the hallway, not daring to look back, feeling that horrible presence following me, breathing down my neck. But as I reached the front door, I couldn't open it, it was stuck. The air grew colder, the walls pressing in on me, and I felt a hand, cold, bony, clawed, wrap around my shoulder. I spun around, only to come face to face with that thing. Its face twisted into a hideous grin, teeth sharp and gleaming in the darkness. Its eyes burned into mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if every ounce of happiness, every good memory I had, was being sucked out of me. "Leave," it whispered, its voice low and distorted, echoing in my head. I don't remember much of what happened after that. Somehow, I managed to get the door open and stumble outside, collapsing on the lawn, gasping for air. I looked back at the house, expecting to see that creature standing in the doorway. But the house was silent, dark, almost serene. The next day, I went back with a friend, determined to retrieve my things and leave for good. As we walked through the house, he seemed completely unfazed, as if he couldn't see the bloodstains, couldn't feel the cold spots, or hear the faint whispers echoing through the halls. I could feel that presence watching us, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I packed as quickly as I could, practically dragging my friend out of the house, my eyes darting around, expecting that thing to appear at any moment. But the house remained silent, the walls bare and empty. I left that day and never went back. Months later, I heard that the house had been sold again, and I wondered if the new owners would experience what I had, or if the presence would lie dormant, waiting. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that whisper, that soft guttural voice telling me to leave. And I wonder if whatever was in that house followed me, if it's waiting in the dark, biding its time. Because when I look in the mirror, sometimes I catch a glimpse of something behind me, just a shadow, a faint outline of that twisted grin and those red, burning eyes. And each time, I feel that icy hand on my shoulder, as if reminding me that it's still there. Hunched and misshapen. It started on an ordinary night in early fall, just as the shadows had begun to creep in earlier, leaving an eerie quiet in the house after dusk. I'd just moved into this place 2 months prior, an old 2-story house a few miles out of town. The seller had practically thrown it at me, the price too low to ignore, and while it was ancient, with creaky wooden floors and a musty smell, I chalked it up to character. The house had history, and I liked that. But things started happening almost as soon as I settled in. I'd shrug off the small stuff at first, rationalizing it away. The flickering lights, faulty wiring, random creaks in the middle of the night. It's an old house, objects in slightly different places, just my imagination. But what happened next, nothing could explain. One night I was lying in bed when a loud bang came from the hallway outside my room. I shot up in bed, heart pounding, listening for any other sounds. Just silence, hanging heavy like a dense fog. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just the house settling, and closed my eyes again. But no sooner had I begun to drift off when I felt watched. I cracked an eye open, letting my gaze slide around the room. Then I saw it. A shape in the corner, dark and slouched, like someone crouching low. My heart hammered. For a second, I thought I saw eyes, glinting in the dim light. But then it was gone. The next morning, I convinced myself it was just a trick of the shadows. But a prickling unease settled into my bones. The days passed, and the tricks in the shadows grew. Flickers of movement, sounds of scratching coming from inside the walls, whispering in the dead of night that would jolt me awake, leaving me shivering in bed. One night, after tossing and turning for hours, I finally caved and decided to get up, thinking maybe a glass of water would help. I shuffled down to the kitchen, rubbing my eyes. But as I rounded the corner, I saw something that made me freeze. There, on the kitchen counter, was a glass of water. It was impossible. No one else was in the house, and I certainly hadn't left it there. Before I could even process it, the glass lifted off the counter on its own and dropped to the floor, shattering with a deafening crash. I stood there, stunned, unable to move. Then, something in the air shifted. I felt the temperature drop, like I'd stepped into a freezer, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. There, in the dark reflection of the window above the sink, was a face. Hollow eyes stared back at me, the skin stretched tight, a mouth twisted into a grotesque open smile that exposed yellowing teeth. It was only for a second, but that face, I'll never forget it. I stumbled back, my hand clamping over my mouth as my mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to get out. I barely slept that night, lying in bed with every light in the house turned on, clutching the blankets like a lifeline. And still, I felt that presence, watching, waiting. The days that followed were filled with more bizarre events. Doors that I'd closed would be open in the morning. Things I'd placed down would be knocked over, and sometimes I'd hear soft footsteps echoing through the empty house, pacing back and forth. Then came the night that changed everything. It was around midnight, and I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, hoping the morning would come soon. But that's when I felt it. A cold hand wrapping around my ankle, squeezing just hard enough to make my skin prickle in fear. I jerked my leg back, bolting upright in bed, but there was nothing there. Panicked, I grabbed my phone, fumbling with it as I turned on the flashlight. I scanned the room, half expecting to see that face again. My room was empty, but the closet door, which I'd closed just hours before, was now slightly ajar. My pulse hammered as I aimed the flashlight at the crack. And then slowly, something pushed the door open. A figure loomed there, hunched and misshapen, with those same hollow eyes staring at me. It took a step forward, its twisted face morphing into something more horrific by the second. Its mouth moved, stretching impossibly wide, as if it were trying to speak. "No," I whispered, barely able to find my voice. "This isn't real." The figure cocked its head, almost mocking me, and then lunged. I shrieked, rolling off the bed and scrambling for the door, adrenaline pounding as I bolted down the stairs. But as I reached the living room, the furniture started to tremble. The chairs, the coffee table, even the bookshelf, all rattling as if in some invisible earthquake. Then, one by one, the lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. Only the faint glow of my phone's flashlight illuminated the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small as possible. That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint but insistent, coming from the other side of the room. "Get out!" it rasped, like a voice from the depths of a nightmare. My heart pounded so hard it hurt, and I forced myself to move, inching my way toward the front door. But before I could reach it, I felt something grab my wrist, cold as death and impossibly strong. It pulled me backward, dragging me toward the darkness of the hallway. I screamed, struggling, my free hand reaching for the walls, for anything to stop it. And then, in a burst of panic-fueled strength, I broke free, stumbling forward and throwing myself against the door. I yanked it open, sprinting out into the night without looking back. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the road, gasping for air, my entire body trembling. I never went back to that house. A week later, I found a small apartment in the city and hired someone to pack up my things. The movers didn't stay in the house long. After an hour, they left half my things behind, refusing to go back inside. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I still have nightmares of that twisted, grinning face watching me from the shadows. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up with the sensation of icy fingers wrapped around my ankle, as if it followed me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Face of evil. The slap that woke me wasn't just a light tap or a brush of my own hand. It was a stinging, hard slap, the kind that jolts you straight from a deep sleep into confusion and terror. My eyes flew open, and for a second, everything was disorienting. My brain scrambled to make sense of where I was, what had just happened, and why my cheek was burning. I looked around my dark bedroom, lit only by the dim glow of the street lamp outside. The room was still, shadows clinging to every corner, and I sat up, blinking, trying to shake off the dream if that's all it had been. But then I saw it. A faint outline in the darkness, like a shadow against the wall near the edge of my bed. The figure was standing too close for comfort, almost leaning in toward me. My heart hammered, and I fumbled for the bedside lamp, slapping the switch in my panic. When the light flickered on, the shadow was gone. Nothing stood beside my bed. I was alone. Or at least it looked that way. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, rubbing my cheek as if to convince myself the slap had just been a weird dream. But the lingering sting on my skin felt too real to dismiss. The next few nights were uneventful. I wrote the incident off as a sleep-induced hallucination. I'd just moved into this apartment, a small, dingy studio in an older part of town, the kind of place that feels like it has history baked into its walls. I told myself I was just adjusting to the new surroundings, and I was stressed out from the recent move and a long work week. But part of me knew something wasn't right. A week later, it happened again. This time, I was wide awake, lying in bed after a long shift at work, just staring at the ceiling. I'd been thinking about how strange my apartment felt, about that slap and that shadow, and I was just about to close my eyes when I felt the sheets tighten around me like someone was pulling them. My heart froze. I hadn't moved. I hadn't touched the sheets. They were being tugged from the foot of the bed, slowly but deliberately. I didn't dare move or breathe. Every inch of my body was tense, coiled like a spring, ready to bolt. But I couldn't see who or what was pulling the sheets. It felt like an invisible force was there, right at the foot of my bed, inching closer. Then, as suddenly as it started, the tugging stopped, and the room fell silent again. I could have sworn I heard faint breathing, but when I reached for the lamp, the room was empty as always. I barely slept that night, every creak and groan of the old apartment sending a fresh jolt of fear through me. By morning, I was running on fumes, the shadows under my eyes growing as restless as the ones in my apartment. But despite the lack of sleep, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. That night, I avoided my bed as long as possible. I stayed on the couch, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, feeling safer away from that strange, suffocating darkness that seemed to hover in my bedroom. But exhaustion eventually won out, and I crept back to bed around midnight, hoping for a peaceful night. But peace was far from what I got. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of someone whispering. The voice was faint, almost unintelligible, but there was something so familiar about it. It was low and scratchy, like it hadn't been used in years. It sounded like me, like a mocking, twisted version of my own voice, muttering incoherent words, just inches from my ear. "Stop," I whispered, squeezing my eyes shut, as if willing the sound to disappear. But it only grew louder, more insistent, more frantic. I was paralyzed, my body frozen with fear, and I could feel a cold presence right beside me, leaning close, whispering. Finally, I mustered the courage to open my eyes, and there, looming over me in the faint light, was a face, a twisted, grinning face, too close, far too close, its eyes wide and blank, staring right into mine. I screamed, scrambling backward, slamming into the wall as I fumbled for the light. When I turned it on, the face was gone. But that sickening grin, those empty eyes, they were burned into my memory. After that night, everything escalated. I'd feel icy fingers brush against my skin in the middle of the night. Sometimes, I'd wake up with bruises on my arms and legs, like someone had been gripping me, holding me down. Objects would move on their own. I'd place my keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them halfway across the room minutes later. Doors would open and close by themselves, and once I came home to find every cabinet in my kitchen flung wide open. One night I was in the bathroom, washing my face, trying to keep my eyes away from the mirror, when I felt that familiar slap on my cheek again. But this time I saw it. My own reflection smirking back at me in the mirror, its eyes dark and hollow, its hand raised as if it were the one that slapped me. I stumbled back, horrified, watching as my reflection moved on its own, mocking me. I covered my eyes, refusing to look, and bolted out of the bathroom. I'd had enough. I called my friend Emma the next day, practically begging her to stay with me for a few days. I couldn't take being alone in that apartment anymore, feeling like something was constantly watching, constantly waiting. When Emma arrived, I could tell she thought I was overreacting, but she agreed to stay. We tried to keep things light, chatting about anything but the apartment, watching movies to distract ourselves. For a while, it worked. But that night, I woke up to Emma screaming. I rushed to her side, flipping on the light, only to find her staring at the ceiling, her face pale as a sheet. "Did you see it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "See what?" I asked, heart pounding. She shook her head, her hands shaking. It was a face up there looking down at me, grinning. We spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, lights blazing, too scared to go back to sleep. Emma left the next day, muttering something about work, but I knew she was just as terrified as I was. Desperate, I reached out to a local paranormal investigator. He came over the next day, a quiet man with an unsettling calmness about him. He walked through the apartment, his face growing grim as he went from room to room. When he got to the bedroom, he stood in front of the mirror for a long time, muttering something under his breath. "This place has a presence," he finally said, looking at me with sympathy. "A dark one. It's been here a long time, attached to this building, to objects. It's feeding off of you." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Can you get rid of it?" He shook his head slowly. "I can try, but sometimes these things don't leave willingly." He performed a cleansing ritual, chanting and burning sage, moving through each room while I watched, clutching my arms. The air felt lighter for a moment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking, waiting. That night I sat in bed, too exhausted to keep my eyes open, but too afraid to sleep. I could feel it, like a weight in the room, pressing down on me, watching. And just as I was drifting off, I felt it. A hard, stinging slap across my cheek. My eyes snapped open, and there it was. The face hovering over me, grinning, so close I could feel its breath, smell the rot. I screamed, scrambling back, heart pounding, as it vanished into the darkness once more. I left that apartment the next day, breaking my lease without a second thought. I never went back, and I never looked in a mirror the same way again. The devil's reflection. It started with small things I could almost brush off as coincidence. I was in my first apartment, barely out of college, a tiny one-bedroom on the edge of town with creaky floors and a big old mirror that came with the place. The landlord said it had been there since the 1930s, just another antique piece of the building. I thought it was pretty cool, a touch of old-world charm. One night, about a week after I moved in, I was brushing my teeth and glanced at my reflection in the mirror. For a split second, something seemed off. I could have sworn my reflection was smiling, only I wasn't smiling. I figured it was just a trick of the light, the way old glass sometimes warps. But when it happened again the next night, my stomach tightened. I didn't stick around in front of the mirror that time. I finished up and bolted out of the bathroom, feeling like an idiot for even letting it get to me. Over the next few days, things got worse. Every time I'd pass the mirror, I'd catch my reflection out of the corner of my eye, just a hair slower than it should have been, like it was lagging behind. I tried to ignore it, but it kept happening little by little, like the mirror was testing me. One night, I actually said out loud, "You're just tired. It's nothing." I guess that's when things really took a turn. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought maybe someone was outside my window, but the whispering was so close, so familiar. I sat up, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, and realized it was coming from the bathroom. I grabbed my phone, using its flashlight as I made my way to the bathroom door, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it jumped out of my chest. Slowly, I pushed the door open, aiming the flashlight toward the mirror. And there it was, my reflection. But something was horribly wrong. My face looked twisted, almost rotting, with hollow eyes that stared back at me, filled with hatred. The skin on my reflection's face was pale, tight, and greyish, almost corpse-like. Its mouth was stretched wide in a sneer that showed teeth I didn't have. My breath caught, and I dropped my phone in shock. The flashlight pointed down, but the figure in the mirror stayed clear as day, even without the light. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, slowly, the figure leaned forward, like it was trying to push through the glass. I stumbled backward, feeling like the room was spinning, and ran back to my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, grinning with teeth like sharpened bones. When dawn finally broke, I told myself I was just sleep deprived, that the stress of a new job and apartment was messing with my head. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Over the next few nights, the noises in my apartment grew louder, scratches on the walls, faint footsteps pacing from room to room. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like I was constantly being watched. I started avoiding the bathroom altogether, terrified of what I'd see in the mirror. One night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it. The sound of heavy breathing. It was close, right next to my bed. I bolted upright and saw nothing, just my empty, dark room. Then I felt a sharp, cold pressure on my shoulder, as if someone's icy fingers were digging into my skin. I jerked away, fumbling for the light, but as soon as I turned it on, the pressure vanished. I could barely hold it together at work the next day. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't keep myself from looking over my shoulder every few seconds. A co-worker noticed my twitchiness and suggested maybe it was time to bring in someone to cleanse the place. Normally, I would have brushed it off, but I was so rattled that I took her advice. That night, I called a local priest, explaining as calmly as I could what had been happening. He agreed to come by the next evening, and I felt a tiny flicker of relief. Maybe this would be enough to stop whatever was haunting my apartment. When the priest arrived, he walked in, took one look at the mirror, and his face paled. He crossed himself, and without a word, began setting up candles and murmuring prayers. I stood in the corner, watching him, my chest tight with anxiety. He sprinkled holy water on the mirror, whispering something in Latin. Suddenly, a blast of freezing air filled the room, and the candle flames flickered. That's when the thing in the mirror came to life. The reflection, twisted and demonic, appeared again, only this time, it wasn't staying put. It lunged forward, pounding against the glass with such force that it sounded like the mirror would shatter. Its face had morphed into something even more grotesque, sunken cheeks, blood-red eyes, a mouth stretched into a horrifying grin. The priest shouted something, and the figure froze, its face twisted with rage. Slowly, it raised a single finger and pointed, directly at me. The priest grabbed my arm and pulled me back, shouting for me not to look at it. He kept chanting, louder and louder, until finally the mirror went dark, and the room fell silent. He turned to me, his face dripping with sweat. "This is no ordinary spirit," he said, his voice shaking. "It's a demon, bound to the mirror." I didn't sleep that night, and neither did he. The next morning he advised me to get rid of the mirror, and he helped me haul it out to the backyard. We set it up on the edge of the property and smashed it to pieces, scattering the shards far and wide. But even as I watched the glass break, I could still feel its eyes on me. For a while, things calmed down. The noises stopped, and the air in the apartment felt lighter. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd finally escaped it. Then, one night about a month later, I was getting ready for bed when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. There, in the bedroom window's reflection, was the face, sunken, red-eyed, grinning. It hasn't left me since. The evil next door. We thought the house was perfect. It was a bit old and run down, but it had charm. A sprawling 2-story Victorian on the edge of town with just enough trees around to feel secluded. And yes, from one window in the upstairs hallway, you could see the cemetery stretching out just beyond our backyard. Sarah and I had laughed it off, thinking it was quaint in a creepy kind of way. After all, who could be scared of a cemetery? I figured it was only spooky if you let your mind go there. But over the next few weeks, our minds didn't have much choice. Whatever was in that house with us was very, very real. It started with little things. Objects would go missing and turn up in strange places. A glass that Sarah swore she left on the counter would end up on the bathroom sink. Lights flickered and dimmed despite new bulbs. The strangest thing, though, was the draft. We couldn't find a source, but there was always a chill in the hallway outside the guest bedroom, which happened to have the one window that overlooked the cemetery. One night, as we lay in bed, we both heard the creaking. It started in the hallway and grew louder as it approached our room. Each step sounded like someone was coming up the stairs, one heavy foot at a time. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and opened the door. But there was nothing there. Just an empty hallway and that bitter chill. Then, Sarah started acting off. At first, I thought she was just stressed from the move, maybe a bit sleep-deprived. But it got worse. She'd be sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at nothing, her lips moving like she was whispering something. When I asked her about it, she'd snap out of it and act like nothing happened. She became withdrawn, almost as if she was somewhere else, her eyes distant and hollow. One night, I woke up to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, muttering softly in a voice that wasn't her own. "What are you doing?" I asked, rubbing my eyes. She turned to me, and for a moment, I barely recognized her. Her eyes were darker, her expression twisted into something almost angry. Then, as if realizing where she was, her face softened and she whispered, I don't know." Things escalated quickly after that. Doors would slam shut by themselves. The draft in the hallway turned ice cold, and every so often I could swear I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, like someone watching us from the shadows. Then one evening, while I was cooking dinner, Sarah stood at the window overlooking the cemetery. I tried talking to her, but she ignored me. She just stared out that window, unmoving. "What are you looking at?" I asked, gently touching her shoulder. She turned to me slowly, her face twisted in a look of such hatred that I stumbled back. Her voice, low and guttural, didn't sound like hers at all. "They're waiting." It was the last straw. I called the police, half convinced Sarah needed medical help, or that something else entirely was wrong in that house. When the officers arrived, I tried explaining the situation, my words tumbling out in a rush. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy. I just needed help. The officers took a quick tour of the house, noting the odd draft in the hallway and a few other strange things. I could see it on their faces. They didn't quite believe me, but they also couldn't ignore what they felt. One officer, Officer Graham, hesitated as he passed the guest bedroom. "You said this is where she was, behaving strangely?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. "Yeah," I replied. "She stares out that window for hours sometimes." The officer's expression darkened. I think you need more than police help here," he said quietly. "There are some things out there we can't explain. My sister went through something like this once. You need a priest." I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying it anymore. The house was infested with something dark, something that was slowly devouring Sarah. I was terrified of leaving her alone even for a moment, so I stayed by her side as much as I could, praying for morning to come. The priest arrived the following afternoon, a tall, lean man named Father Michael. He listened quietly as I explained the strange happenings, his face calm and unreadable. When I finished, he simply nodded and told me to show him around. He stopped in the hallway, sensing the draft, and paused by the guest room, his eyes lingering on the window overlooking the cemetery. "It's thin here," he murmured, almost to himself. "Thin?" I echoed, not understanding. He looked at me, his eyes grim. "A place where the boundary between the living and the dead is thin. This house has a connection to whatever rests beyond that cemetery." Father Michael spent the next few hours walking through each room, whispering prayers under his breath. When he reached the guest room, he set up his things: a crucifix, holy water, and a small candle. Sarah, who had been unresponsive all day, suddenly seemed agitated, pacing around the room, her fingers twitching. I tried to calm her down, but she was beyond reason, her eyes fixed on the priest with an intensity that frightened me. Father Michael began the blessing, and almost immediately, the temperature in the room plummeted. A low, guttural growl filled the air, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Sarah shrieked, doubling over as if in pain, her body convulsing as she let out a guttural scream that made my blood turn cold. "Hold her!" Father Michael commanded, and I grabbed her arms, struggling to keep her still. She fought against me with a strength I didn't know she had, her eyes black as night, her face twisted into something inhuman. "Leave!" she snarled, her voice a distorted echo of her own. "She belongs to us." I held her tighter, whispering her name, pleading with her to come back. Father Michael continued his prayers, louder and more forceful, as if trying to drown out whatever was possessing her. The air grew heavy, the walls seeming to close in around us. Shadows danced across the room, writhing like living things, and the sound of scratching filled my ears, as if something were trying to claw its way in. Then, with a final cry, Sarah went limp in my arms, her body sagging as if she'd been drained of every ounce of energy. The temperature in the room rose back to normal, and the shadows receded, leaving only silence in their wake. Father Michael looked exhausted, beads of sweat dotting his forehead, but he managed a weary smile. "It's over," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "For now." I couldn't bring myself to ask him what he meant by "for now." All I knew was that Sarah was back. She opened her eyes, blinking in confusion, and for the first time in days, I saw recognition there. She was herself again, and I didn't care what it took to keep it that way. The next few days were quiet. Sarah seemed drained, but otherwise she was back to normal. The strange noises had stopped, the draft in the hallway had disappeared, and the house felt peaceful. But every now and then I'd catch her looking out that window, her eyes distant, her face pale. And on more than one occasion, I thought I saw movement in the cemetery, a shadowy figure standing among the graves, watching the house. One evening, as we were getting ready for bed, Sarah turned to me, her face pale and serious. "You heard it too, didn't you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Heard what?" She looked down, her hands trembling. "The voice. The one that said, 'She belongs to us.'" I swallowed, a cold shiver running down my spine. I hadn't told her what the voice had said that night. She hadn't been conscious to hear it. You've braved the darkness with us. Subscribe and keep the spirits at bay. Until next time, sleep if you dare.